one bride, one wedding, one secret that could destroy everything. Lucy wasn't just getting married, she was taking back the truth. Everyone thinks this is a perfect wedding, but Lucy knows the truth. In just one moment, she's about to expose a secret so shocking it will destroy a family, ruin the groom, and leave every guest breathless. This is the day the wind was stolen. She stood at the altar in $1,000 dress, bouquet trembling in her hands, about to say two words that would destroy everything. But they weren't "I do." What Lucy was about to unleash would shatter 200 lives in the next 60 seconds, turn a fairy tale wedding into a courtroom, and expose secrets that powerful people had buried for decades. The question isn't whether she should have done it. The question is, could you have stayed silent? Lucy Matthews sat in front of the gilded mirror in the bridal suite of the Riverside estate, one of the most expensive wedding venues in Connecticut. Her reflection stared back at her, makeup flawless, hair styled in elegant waves that had taken 3 hours to perfect. Around her, 5 bridesmaids buzzed with excitement, adjusting her veil, spraying perfume, laughing about the night ahead. But Lucy wasn't laughing. Her hands rested on a manila folder hidden beneath a silk robe draped across her lap, and inside that folder was enough evidence to end the life she'd built over the past 2 years. The wedding was supposed to start in 40 minutes. Guests were already arriving downstairs, champagne glasses clinking, string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon in D. Everything was perfect. Everything was a lie. 6 months earlier, Lucy had been blissfully unaware. She'd met Ben Harrington at a charity gala, one of those black tie events where tech entrepreneurs mingled with old money families and everyone pretended to care about the cause. Ben had been charming, attentive, different from the finance bros she usually encountered in Boston. He didn't brag about his trust fund or his family's real estate empire. He seemed genuine, humble even, talking about his work with nonprofit housing development and his dream of making affordable homes accessible to working families. Lucy had fallen hard and fast. By their 3rd date, she knew he was special. By their 6th month together, he'd proposed on a beach in Cape Cod with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. Lucy had said yes without hesitation, believing she'd found her person, her future, her forever. But 3 months ago, everything changed. Lucy had been helping Ben's mother organize files for a family foundation event when she stumbled across something odd. A series of property transfers dated back 15 years, all involving neighborhoods that had been gentrified almost overnight. The addresses seemed familiar. Lucy, who worked as a financial analyst, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She'd made copies of a few documents, telling herself she was being paranoid, that there had to be a reasonable explanation. But when she quietly started digging, cross-referencing public records and old news articles, the reasonable explanation vanished. What she found instead was a pattern of fraud so calculated that it had ruined hundreds of lives while making the Harrington family millions. Now, sitting in this bridal suite surrounded by laughter and champagne, Lucy opened the folder one more time. Inside were printed emails showing how Ben's father, Richard Harrington, had orchestrated a scheme to buy low-income housing properties through shell companies, then falsify inspection reports to condemn the buildings. Families were evicted with 48 hours' notice, told their homes were unsafe, their belongings sometimes thrown into dumpsters before they could retrieve them. The city would sell the land at auction, and mysteriously, Richard's companies always won the bids, paying pennies on the dollar. Those neighborhoods were then developed into luxury condos that working families could never afford. The displaced residents scattered across the state, some becoming homeless, children pulled from schools, elderly people losing the only homes they had known for decades, and the Harringtons got richer. Lucy had tracked down 12 families directly affected by these schemes. She'd recorded their stories, collected their documents, sat in their living rooms, and listened as mothers cried about sleeping in cars with their children. One woman, Marie Torres, had lost everything when her apartment building was condemned. She'd been forced to move 3 hours away from the hospital where her daughter was receiving cancer treatment. By the time Marie could arrange transportation and housing closer to the hospital, her daughter's condition had worsened. The girl died 2 months later. Marie showed Lucy a photo of her daughter, a bright-eyed 10-year-old named Sophia, holding a trophy from a spelling bee. Sophia would have been 16 now. Marie had looked Lucy in the eyes and said, "Someone needs to know what they did. Someone needs to care." Lucy cared. She cared so much that she'd spent the last 3 months of her engagement secretly building a case, meeting with investigative journalists, consulting with lawyers, gathering irrefutable evidence. She'd wrestled with what to do. Should she confront Ben privately, call off the wedding quietly, go to the authorities first? But every option felt inadequate. Richard Harrington had connections everywhere. Lawyers who could bury cases for years, politicians who owed him favors, media contacts who would spin any story in his favor. If Lucy went through normal channels, the Harringtons would know she was coming, and the evidence might disappear. Witnesses might be intimidated or paid off. Justice might never come. So Lucy made a decision that most people would call crazy. She would use the one moment when the Harringtons couldn't hide, when 200 witnesses would be gathered in one room, many of them recording on their phones, when walking away would be impossible. She would use her own wedding. Her bridesmaid, Kelly, touched her shoulder. "Lucy, you seem a million miles away." Lucy closed the folder and slid it into her oversized bridal bag. She forced a smile. "Just nervous, I guess. Big day?" Kelly laughed. "Girl, you're about to marry a literal prince. Ben is perfect. His family is perfect. You won the lottery." Lucy's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I guess I did." Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Downstairs in the grand hall of Riverside Estate, 200 guests filled velvet cushioned chairs arranged in perfect rows. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across marble floors, and enormous arrangements of white roses and peonies decorated every surface. The Harrington family had spared no expense. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a statement, a display of wealth and power that would be photographed, shared on social media, and talked about in Connecticut social circles for months. Ben Harrington stood near the altar, adjusting his bow tie for the 3rd time. He looked every bit the perfect groom, tall, handsome, confident in his custom-tailored tuxedo. His best man, his college roommate Jake, clapped him on the shoulder. "Nervous?" Ben grinned. "Not even a little. Lucy's the one. I've never been more sure of anything." At the back of the hall, Ben's father, Richard Harrington, held court with several business associates, a champagne flute in one hand and a cigar waiting in his pocket for after the ceremony. Richard was 62, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of getting exactly what he wanted. He'd built the Harrington real estate empire from the ground up, or so he told people, conveniently omitting the darker details of how that empire had been constructed. His wife, Patricia, floated through the crowd in a pale blue gown, greeting guests, accepting compliments, playing the role of the gracious society matron. She'd planned this wedding for months, micromanaging every detail, determined that her son's marriage would be the social event of the season. But not everyone in the room was celebrating. Scattered among the guests were a few people who felt uneasy, people who'd heard whispers about the Harrington family's business practices, people who'd wondered how Richard always seemed to come out on top of every deal. Lucy's mother, Janet Matthews, sat in the second row, clutching her purse with both hands. She'd noticed something off about her daughter lately, a distance, a distraction. Janet had asked Lucy multiple times if everything was okay, if she was having second thoughts, if Ben was treating her well. Lucy had insisted everything was fine, but a mother knows. Janet couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The string quartet transitioned into a new piece, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Guests settled into their seats, phones out and ready to capture the moment. Ben took his position at the altar, flanked by his groomsmen. The officiant, a family friend of the Harringtons, stood ready with his notes. Patricia dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, already emotional. Richard checked his watch. Everything was on schedule, perfect, controlled, exactly as a Harrington event should be. And then the music changed. The familiar notes of Pachelbel's canon in D filled the hall, and everyone rose to their feet, turning toward the back of the room where Lucy would appear. Ben's heart swelled with anticipation. In just a few minutes, Lucy Matthews would become Lucy Harrington, his wife, his partner, his forever. He had no idea that forever was about to end before it even started. The doors opened, and Lucy appeared, a vision in white lace and silk. Her dress had a long train that whispered across the floor as she walked, and her veil was delicate, almost ethereal in the soft light. Gasps and whispers of admiration rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed, Ben's eyes filled with tears. This was the moment he'd dreamed about. But if anyone had looked closely at Lucy's face, really looked, they would have seen something unusual. Her smile was fixed, almost mechanical. Her eyes were focused not on Ben, but on a point somewhere beyond him, as if she were seeing something no one else could see. In her left hand, she carried a bouquet of white roses. In her right hand, hidden within the folds of her dress, she clutched the manila folder. Lucy walked slowly down the aisle, each step measured, deliberate. Her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. This was it. There was no turning back now. As she passed her mother, she caught Janet's eye and gave her a small, sad smile. Janet's brow furrowed with concern. Lucy looked away and kept walking. She passed friends from college, co-workers from her firm, distant relatives who'd flown in from across the country. They were all smiling, happy, completely unaware of what was about to happen. And then there was Ben. He stood at the altar, tears streaming down his face, looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. For a moment, Lucy's resolve wavered. Ben wasn't like his father. Ben was kind, thoughtful, caring. He volunteered at homeless shelters. He donated to causes. He'd never personally evicted anyone or falsified a document. Did he deserve what was about to happen? But then Lucy remembered Sophia Torres, the 10-year-old girl who'd died because her family was forced away from her medical care. She remembered Marie Torres's face when she described watching her daughter slip away. She remembered the dozens of other families whose lives had been destroyed, who'd lost their homes, their stability, their sense of safety in the world. Ben might be innocent of his father's crimes, but he'd certainly benefited from them. Every privilege he'd enjoyed, every opportunity he'd been given, every dollar in his trust fund had been built on other people's suffering. And more importantly, if Lucy married into this family without exposing the truth, she would become complicit. She would be choosing comfort over justice, choosing her own happiness over the voices of people who'd been silenced. Lucy reached the altar and stood facing Ben. The officiant smiled warmly and began, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Benjamin Harrington and Lucy Matthews in holy matrimony. Marriage is a sacred commitment built on trust, honesty, and love." The words echoed in Lucy's mind: trust, honesty, love. She glanced at Richard Harrington in the front row, looking proud and satisfied. She thought about all the lies he'd told, all the families he'd betrayed, all the trust he'd destroyed. The officiant continued, "If anyone here has any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." The traditional pause followed, a formality that no one ever expected to interrupt. But Lucy didn't let the moment pass. She took a deep breath and spoke, "I do." The hall fell silent. 200 people froze. Ben's face went from confused to alarmed in an instant. The officiant blinked, uncertain how to proceed. Patricia Harrington's mouth fell open. Richard Harrington's expression darkened. Lucy turned away from Ben and faced the crowd, her voice steady and clear. "I have something to say. I'm sorry to do this here, in front of all of you. But this is the only way to make sure the truth is heard." Ben reached for her arm. "Lucy, what are you doing?" She stepped back, out of his reach, and held up the manila folder. "I'm doing what someone should have done a long time ago." And then, with every eye in the room on her, Lucy began to speak. She told them about the shell companies, the falsified inspection reports, the orchestrated evictions. She told them about the families who'd been displaced, the children who'd been traumatized, the elderly people who'd lost their life savings. She told them about Sofia Torres, a little girl who died because her family was forced away from her medical care. Lucy opened the folder and held up documents one by one. Bank statements showing payments to corrupt inspectors, emails between Richard Harrington and city officials, discussing which properties to target next. Photos of families with their belongings piled on sidewalks, crying children holding stuffed animals, elderly men and women looking lost and broken. Lucy's voice never wavered. She spoke with the precision of the financial analyst she was, presenting facts, dates, numbers, evidence that couldn't be denied. The room was utterly silent except for her voice. Some guests pulled out their phones and started recording. Others sat frozen, unable to process what they were hearing. Patricia Harrington clutched her chest, looking like she might faint. Richard's face had gone from dark to red, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair like he was about to launch himself at Lucy. Ben stood at the altar, paralyzed. He looked at Lucy, then at his father, then back at Lucy. "This can't be real. Tell me this isn't real." Lucy met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd started walking down the aisle, her voice softened. "I'm sorry, Ben, but it is real. Your father destroyed people's lives to build his fortune, and I can't marry into this family knowing what I know. I can't be silent. These people deserve justice." Ben's face crumpled. He looked at his father. "Dad, tell her she's wrong. Tell her this is some kind of mistake." Richard didn't answer. He didn't deny anything. He just stared at Lucy with cold fury in his eyes, and that silence was more damning than any confession. Lucy continued, her voice growing stronger as she went on. She wasn't just exposing Richard Harrington. She was giving voice to every person who'd been silenced, every family who'd been dismissed, every victim who'd been told they didn't matter. She described how Richard's companies had targeted low-income neighborhoods, specifically because the residents had fewer resources to fight back, no lawyers on retainer, no political connections, no media access. She explained how the Harringtons had made millions by buying properties for almost nothing, and then developing luxury condos that the original residents could never afford to live in. She talked about the gentrification that followed, how entire communities were erased, how cultural landmarks and small businesses were bulldozed to make room for artisan coffee shops and yoga studios. And then, Lucy did something that no one expected. She called out specific people in the room. "Mr. Davidson," she said, pointing to a man in the third row, a city councilman who'd accepted campaign donations from Richard Harrington. "You approved rezoning for 3 of these projects, even though residents filed over 100 complaints. You ignored them." Mr. Davidson's face went white. Lucy turned to another guest. "Mrs. Chen, you're a lawyer. You represented the Harrington companies in court and helped get eviction notices expedited, cutting legal timelines in half so families had no time to find new housing." Mrs. Chen stood up, shaking her head. "I was just doing my job." Lucy's eyes blazed. "You were helping destroy lives." The crowd erupted. Some people started shouting questions, others defended themselves. A few guests stood up and walked out, unwilling to be part of the spectacle. Ben sank to his knees at the altar, his head in his hands. Patricia Harrington finally fainted, and 2 guests rushed to help her. Richard Harrington stood up, his voice booming across the hall. "This is slander! This is a malicious attack on my family, and I will sue you for every penny you have." Lucy didn't flinch. She held up her phone. "I've already sent copies of all this evidence to 3 investigative journalists, a federal prosecutor, and several advocacy organizations. You can sue me if you want, Mr. Harrington, but the truth is already out there. You can't bury it anymore." Richard's lawyer, who'd been sitting near the back, hurried forward and whispered urgently in his ear. Richard's face shifted from anger to calculation. He knew he was in real trouble, the kind of trouble that money and connections might not be able to fix. Lucy looked around the room one last time. Her eyes found her mother, who was crying but also nodding, silently telling Lucy she was proud. Lucy found Kelly, her bridesmaid, who looked shocked, but gave her a small thumbs up. And then Lucy looked at Ben, still kneeling at the altar, and for a moment her heart broke. She had loved him. Part of her still did. But love couldn't outweigh justice. "I'm sorry," Lucy said quietly, speaking directly to Ben now. "I'm sorry that you're caught in the middle of this. I'm sorry that your father's choices have consequences for you, but I couldn't marry you knowing what I know. I couldn't build a life on a foundation of lies and stolen lives. You deserve better than that, and so do all the people your family hurt." Ben looked up at her, tears streaming down his face. "You should have told me. You should have given me a chance to help." Lucy's voice was gentle but firm. "Would you have believed me? Would you have stood against your own father?" Ben opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He didn't know, and that not knowing was answer enough. The hall descended into chaos. Guests were shouting, "Summit Lucy! some at Richard, some at each other. Security guards hired for the wedding stood uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene or who to protect. Several guests had their phones out, live streaming the scene to social media. Within minutes, clips of Lucy's revelation were spreading across the internet, shared and reshared, going viral in real time. News outlets picked up the story within the hour. Connecticut wedding turns into corruption exposé was trending on Twitter. Camera crews from local stations were already racing to the venue. Richard Harrington tried to regain control. He demanded that people stop recording, threatened legal action, insisted that Lucy was mentally unstable and spreading lies. But the evidence was too solid, too detailed, too public now. His denials only made him look more guilty. Patricia Harrington, now revived and sitting in a chair, stared at her husband with dawning horror. "Richard, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't do these things." Richard ignored her, focused on damage control, talking rapidly with his lawyer. Patricia's face crumpled. She'd spent decades as the perfect society wife, hosting charity galas, serving on nonprofit boards, believing that her husband was a respectable businessman. Now she was learning that her entire life had been built on corruption and cruelty. She stood up shakily and walked out of the hall, her expensive gown trailing behind, her world collapsing with every step. Ben finally got to his feet. He walked over to Lucy, his face a mixture of anger, hurt, and confusion. "Why like this? Why did you have to destroy everything in front of everyone?" Lucy met his gaze steadily. "Because your father has spent decades hiding the truth, and powerful people have helped him do it. If I'd confronted him privately, he would have made it all disappear. This was the only way to make sure people actually saw the evidence, actually heard the stories." Ben shook his head. "You've ruined my family." Lucy's voice was soft but unyielding. "Your father ruined families. I just made sure people knew about it." Ben stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away, following his mother out of the hall. As the crowd slowly dispersed, some guests approached Lucy. A few were angry, accusing her of seeking attention or staging a stunt. But others thanked her. A woman Lucy didn't recognize came up with tears in her eyes. "My sister lost her home in one of those evictions. She's been struggling ever since. Thank you for speaking up." An older man shook Lucy's hand. "I'm a retired investigative reporter. I looked into the Harringtons years ago but couldn't get enough evidence to publish. What you did today took guts." Lucy felt exhausted, emotionally drained, but also strangely free. She'd done it. She'd told the truth. Whatever happened next, at least the silence was broken. Lucy's mother pushed through the crowd and wrapped her daughter in a fierce hug. "I don't fully understand what just happened, but I know you did what you thought was right. I'm proud of you." Lucy clung to her mother and finally let herself cry. All the stress, fear, and grief of the past 3 months came pouring out. She'd given up the man she loved, the future she'd planned, the life she'd imagined. But she'd also given voice to people who'd been ignored for too long. She'd chosen justice over comfort. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of her wedding, Lucy felt certain she'd made the right choice, the only choice she could live with. An hour later, the grand hall was nearly empty. Staff had started cleaning up, folding chairs and collecting abandoned champagne glasses. Lucy sat alone on the steps leading to the altar, still in her wedding dress, the manila folder resting beside her. She'd sent her mother home, assured her bridesmaids she was okay, and declined multiple interview requests from reporters who'd arrived on the scene. She just needed a moment to breathe, to process what she'd done. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, texts from friends and strangers, some supportive, some vicious. Social media was a battlefield. Some people were calling her a hero, applauding her courage. Others were attacking her, claiming she was vindictive, that she'd orchestrated a public humiliation for attention. Lucy didn't read most of the messages. She knew the truth, and that was enough. Outside the venue, news vans lined the driveway. Reporters scrambled to piece together the story, interviewing guests as they left, trying to get statements from the Harrington family. Richard Harrington had lawyered up immediately, refusing to comment. But the damage was done. Several city officials mentioned in Lucy's evidence were already facing calls for resignation. The federal prosecutor's office confirmed they were opening an investigation into the Harrington real estate empire. Advocacy groups were organizing press conferences, demanding justice for displaced families. The story was too big to bury now. Within days, it would be national news. Ben Harrington sat in his car in the parking lot, unable to bring himself to leave. He'd taken off his bow tie and unbuttoned his collar, feeling like he couldn't breathe. His whole life had been upended in less than an hour. He thought about confronting his father, demanding answers, but he wasn't sure he could handle hearing the truth confirmed. Part of him still wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding, that Lucy had gotten bad information, that his father could explain everything. But deep down, Ben knew. He'd always known, hadn't he? There had been signs over the years, overheard conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, deals that seemed too good to be true, a family wealth that didn't quite match his father's official business history. Ben had chosen not to ask questions, chosen not to look too closely, because it was easier that way. And now he was paying the price for that willful ignorance. Lucy's phone rang. It was Marie Torres, the mother of Sophia, the little girl who died after being displaced from her home. Lucy answered. Marie's voice was thick with emotion. I saw what you did. Someone sent me a video. Lucy, I can't believe you actually did it. You kept your promise. Lucy's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry it took so long. I'm so sorry it couldn't bring Sophia back. Marie was crying now. But it means something. It means people will finally know what happened to us. It means my daughter's story will be heard. Thank you so much. After they hung up, Lucy sat in silence, clutching her phone. This was why she'd done it. Not for revenge, not for attention, but for Sophia and all the other children like her. For the families who'd been treated as disposable, for the voices that had been silenced. As evening fell, Lucy finally stood up and walked out of the hall. She still wore her wedding dress, now slightly wrinkled and dusty, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. A few reporters called out questions as she emerged, but Lucy didn't stop. She got into her car and drove away from the Riverside estate, away from the life she'd almost had, toward an uncertain but honest future. In her rearview mirror, she watched the venue disappear, and she didn't look back. Scene 7. Lucy's reflection and resolution. 3 days later, Lucy sat on the balcony of her small apartment overlooking downtown Boston. She'd returned to her normal life, though nothing felt normal anymore. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job, needing time to deal with the aftermath of what the media was now calling the wedding day exposé. Her apartment was modest, a far cry from the luxury she would have known as Ben Harrington's wife. But it was hers, earned with her own work, untainted by stolen wealth. Lucy held a cup of tea and watched the city lights flicker in the evening darkness. Her phone sat beside her, turned off for the first time in days. She'd needed a break from the constant barrage of messages, interview requests, hate mail, and support from strangers. She needed to be alone with her thoughts. Lucy thought about Ben, wondering how he was coping, whether he hated her, whether he understood why she'd done what she did. She'd written him a letter, trying to explain everything, but she hadn't sent it. What was there to say that she hadn't already said at the altar? Part of her hoped that Ben would eventually see his father's actions for what they were, that he'd use his privilege and resources to make things right, to help the families his father had harmed. But Lucy knew that was probably wishful thinking. People don't change easily, especially when change means confronting uncomfortable truths about the people they love. Still, she hoped. Hope was all she had left when it came to Ben. The investigation into Richard Harrington's business practices was moving quickly. The evidence Lucy had provided was compelling, and more victims were coming forward now that they knew someone was listening. A class action lawsuit had been filed on behalf of displaced families, seeking compensation and housing assistance. Several city officials had resigned or been placed on administrative leave, pending their own investigations. The Harrington real estate empire was crumbling, and Richard himself was facing potential criminal charges for fraud, corruption, and racketeering. Patricia Harrington had filed for divorce, released a public statement condemning her husband's actions, and pledged to donate a significant portion of her personal assets to organizations helping homeless families. Lucy didn't know if Patricia's actions were genuine or just damage control, but at least it was something. Lucy thought about her own future. She'd lost her fiancé, disrupted her career, and become a public figure she'd never wanted to be. But she'd also gained something precious: peace of mind. She could look at herself in the mirror now without shame, without the gnawing guilt that had consumed her during those months of secret investigation. She'd done the right thing, the hard thing, and she could live with the consequences. Lucy opened the manila folder one last time, looking at the faces in the photographs, the families whose stories she'd told. Sophia Torres smiled up at her from a school picture, bright-eyed and full of potential. Lucy whispered, "I hope I made you proud." And somehow, sitting there on her balcony under the stars, Lucy felt like, just maybe, she had. Over the next few weeks, Lucy received letters from people across the country. Some were from other victims of predatory real estate practices, thanking her for shining a light on an issue that rarely got attention. Others were from young women who said Lucy had inspired them to speak up about injustices they'd witnessed. A few were from people who'd been in similar situations, torn between loyalty to someone they loved and the need to expose wrongdoing. They shared their stories, their struggles, their regrets, and their hopes. Lucy read every letter, responded to as many as she could, and realized that what she'd done had resonated far beyond one corrupt family in Connecticut. One letter stood out. It was from a lawyer named David Chen, no relation to the lawyer who'd worked for the Harringtons. David worked for a nonprofit legal organization that represented low-income tenants. He wrote, "What you did took extraordinary courage. We've been fighting cases like this for years. But we rarely have someone willing to speak out so publicly and so powerfully. I wanted to reach out because we could use someone with your skills and your moral clarity. If you're interested, we'd love to talk to you about joining our team." Lucy stared at the letter for a long time. She'd never considered advocacy work before, always seen herself as a behind-the-scenes numbers person, but maybe this was her path forward. Maybe she could use her financial expertise to help people instead of just analyzing corporate spreadsheets. She picked up her phone, turned it on, and sent David Chen an email. "I'd love to talk." 6 months later, Lucy sat in a small conference room with Marie Torres and 11 other families who'd been displaced by Richard Harrington's schemes. They'd just received news that the class action lawsuit had been settled. It wasn't everything the families deserved. No amount of money could undo the trauma and loss they'd experienced, but it was substantial compensation that would help them rebuild their lives. Some would be able to afford down payments on homes. Others would pay off debts incurred during their periods of housing instability. Marie would establish a scholarship fund in Sophia's name for children affected by housing displacement. The families were crying, hugging each other, thanking Lucy over and over. Lucy hugged them back, feeling a sense of purpose she'd never experienced in her old corporate job. Richard Harrington had pled guilty to multiple charges of fraud and corruption in exchange for a reduced sentence. He'd serve 8 years in federal prison, lose his business licenses, and be required to pay millions in restitution. It wasn't enough. Not really. But it was more accountability than powerful men like Richard usually faced. Patricia Harrington had followed through on her pledge, donating over $10 million to housing advocacy organizations and homeless shelters. She'd also started speaking publicly about the importance of questioning where family wealth comes from, admitting that she'd been willfully blind for too long. Lucy didn't know if Patricia's transformation was genuine, but it was having a positive impact, and that mattered. Ben Harrington had reached out to Lucy once, 3 months after the wedding that never was. They had met for coffee in a neutral location, both nervous, both carrying the weight of everything that had happened. Ben looked different, thinner, older somehow. He'd been working with a therapist, trying to process his father's crimes and his own complicated feelings of grief, anger, and guilt. He'd also been working behind the scenes to help some of the displaced families, using his connections to find them jobs and housing, trying to make amends in small ways. Lucy and Ben talked for 2 hours, honest and painful conversation where they both said things that needed to be said. Ben admitted that he'd been angry at first, felt betrayed and humiliated. But over time, he'd come to understand why Lucy had done what she did. He even thanked her, though his voice broke when he said it. They parted as friends, not lovers, both knowing they could never go back to what they'd almost had, but grateful for the closure. Lucy now worked full-time for the nonprofit legal organization David Chen had invited her to join. She used her financial skills to investigate predatory lending practices, fraudulent evictions, and corporate landlords who violated tenant rights. She testified in court, educated communities about their legal protections, and helped families fight back against exploitation. It was demanding work that paid far less than her old corporate job, but it filled her with a sense of meaning she'd never known before. She was making a difference, one family at a time, one corrupt system at a time. And every night, she went to sleep, knowing that she'd chosen the right path. The story of the wedding day exposé faded from the news cycle eventually, replaced by new scandals and crises, but its impact lingered. Law schools taught Lucy's case as an example of moral courage and the ethics of whistleblowing. Housing advocacy groups held annual awards in her name, recognizing people who spoke truth to power at great personal cost. And somewhere in a file in Lucy's apartment, preserved carefully, was the manila folder that had changed everything, a reminder of the day she'd stood at an altar and chosen justice over comfort, truth over silence. Lucy sometimes took out that folder and looked at the photos, especially Sophia Torres's bright smile, and she whispered the same words she'd said that night on her balcony. I hope I made you proud. And now, working in the nonprofit world, helping families every day, Lucy felt certain that she had. As for Richard Harrington, he sat in a federal prison, stripped of his wealth, power, and reputation, finally held accountable for the lives he'd destroyed. And Lucy Matthews, the bride who stole the wind, continued her work. A quiet force for justice in a world that desperately needed people brave enough to speak up, even when silence would have been easier. If you'd been in Lucy's position, standing at that altar with evidence of terrible wrongs in your hands, would you have had the courage to speak? Would you have chosen justice over the life you'd planned? How would you feel watching someone you loved be implicated in crimes they may not have personally committed but certainly benefited from? These aren't easy questions, but they're the questions Lucy Matthews had to answer. And on that day, in front of 200 witnesses, she gave her answer. Not I do, but I must. And sometimes that's the only answer that matters.